Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing The Cutting Season by Attica Locke. This is the second book that I've read by Attica Locke. I've had it on my reading list for quite some time, since reading the first book, which I also enjoyed, but I try to space out books by authors. So typically try not to review more than one book by the same author within the same year, within a year span. But I like Black history, but on the fiction side of things, I like books about characters, families, communities. I still read books about, people from other parts of the world, other races and ethnic groups and whatnot. But in reading and reviewing books for Noir Histoire, it's allowed me to dive more deeply. And it's offered an opportunity for me to seek out various types of books from across the diaspora and about Black people. And so far I've been pretty pleased with the books I've come across. And something that I don't really touch on in this channel, aside from every now and then, is that I actually really like true crime, books about the justice system, police procedurals, both fiction and nonfiction. So I read quite a bit of books about those topics, as well as listen to podcasts and watch documentaries and things like that. It's just a subject that I find very interesting. So when I come across books that combine my various interests, so Black history, the Black community, the justice system, police procedurals, it just checks boxes for me and tends to draw me in. The previous book that I read by Locke was about a Texas Ranger and him investigating a case out in Texas. The Cutting Season is similar in some sense, but also different. It takes place in New Orleans, and due to my interest in food, Black culture, New Orleans in particular, since my childhood, has been a fantasy place to visit. I finally had the chance a few years ago. And so when I added this book to my reading list, I knew it was going to be a police procedural, different character than the previous book, and that there would be a murder, and the book would cover the story of figuring out who committed the crime and the other circumstances and whatnot. It wasn't until I actually started reading the book that I realized it took place in Louisiana. So that just added an extra layer to the story as far as the vibe and the feel that you get. Now granted, you're reading, so you're having to use your mind's eye to imagine and envision the characters, the environments and settings. But having watched a number of movies, read several books about New Orleans, and having actually visited, and about more broadly Louisiana, there's a certain vibe that comes to mind. I think of New Orleans and I think of food. I think about music, sort of there's a Caribbean type vibe in New Orleans, and it's sometimes referred to as the most northern Caribbean city. And so in thinking of New Orleans, some people might think of voodoo and whatnot, but outside of New Orleans, you might think of swamps and hanging Spanish moss. So when I picked up this book and realized that it takes place just a little bit outside of New Orleans, that it's actually taking place somewhat closer to Baton Rouge, but in a somewhat rural area, it immediately called to mind this vision, right? That granted, it doesn't take place in a swamp, but kind of this hot, humid environment. In reading, the book, the author does a really good job of describing the environment. It takes place on the Belle Vie plantation. So within the story, the Belle Vie plantation was once a real plantation. But in the years since the Civil War, since the end of the Civil War, a family has taken it over and refurbished it, renovated it into an event space and museum of sorts. As part of that, you see some commentary on let's say these real life tourist attractions that you have throughout the South, these recreated slave plantations, or if you think on a larger scale, colonial Williamsburg, where people go to these tourist attractions that supposedly allow them to take a step back into time to see how people lived in years past. So at Belle Vie Plantation, they have it set up where the house has been restored to its old form to a degree, right? Because it does have some modern conveniences, but the house has been restored to give visitors a sense of what it might have been in the past. Visitors go to the house, they see the big house. In addition to that, given that this is Louisiana, this is the South, you also have this less commented upon reality that As part of this place having been a plantation, slaves lived on the property. The owners of this plantation owned slaves, right? The house would have been maintained by, the land cultivated by enslaved people. And so while you have this huge estate with this big cabin on it, you also have slave cabins. And so the book really touches on the story of this woman, Karen, whose family has generational ties to this land and the surrounding area. In years past, her ancestors were enslaved on this plantation or nearby. One particular family member, Jason, was an ancestor who was born onto another plantation across the river, but brought to Belle Vie as a little boy. He spent the rest of his life enslaved there and later on as a freedman. And so Karen's family ties goes back for several generations. Coming down the line, her mother actually used to be the cook for Belle Vie Plantation. Because as I mentioned, in addition to it serving as like a museum of sorts, it's also an event space. And given the grounds and the house and whatnot, you know, like the antebellum architecture, lifestyle and whatnot, some people romanticize that. People have weddings at this place. They also have like luncheons and other types of events and whatnot on the grounds of Belle Vie. And so Karen's mother, Helen, used to be the cook at the house, helping to prepare food for events. And so Karen pretty much grew up in the area. Her family's from the area, but as she got older, she took advantage of opportunities to get out of the small town and went to New Orleans for some time where she attended college, Tulane. Money issues resulted in her having to drop out of college, but along the way she met someone while at school. She was studying to become a lawyer. The two of them ended up having a relationship and they had a daughter together. Unfortunately, things happened which resulted in the relationship falling apart, but now they have this child together. Karen and her daughter live here. The dad is back in DC. There's some strain there. There's some unresolved issues. And so in that sense, you get that Karen is like looking back over her life. And when the book picks up, she's now the manager of Belle Vie. So she helps them to organize events. She manages the staff, manages the museum side of things, as well as the events. And so you get the sense that like she's earning a living. It's enabling her to take care of her daughter, but she feels like she's not really where she wants to be in life or where she thought she would be in life, by this point in life. And so, you know, like that resonated with me. I think it would resonate with a lot of people. She has this daughter that, you know, is out in this rural area where she grew up. But by the time the book picks up, Karen's mother has passed away. She doesn't really have much of any other family, at least not nearby. She doesn't have much of a support system as far as like a family-based support system. But through the years, she's hired someone to help her with her daughter, like getting her daughter off to school, picked up from school, to help with the cooking and whatnot. And so over the years, this woman has become a pretty good friend. But yet still you get like this kind of sense of loneliness with her, where she really just has a daughter. She's a single woman. She's a single mom and she has this job, but it's not really what she thought she would be doing. And so she doesn't really seem to have like any friends nearby. She doesn't have much of a social life. Her life pretty much consists of going to work and taking care of her daughter. So Jason is Karen's ancestor, and he did pretty okay for himself after the Civil War. The family that owned him, like, you know, they had some degree of wealth and whatnot, and they've handed this property on down through the line. They have some wealth, they have some political connections, and now in this present generation, that is Karen's generation, they're comfortable in doing quite well for themselves. There are two brothers, and their father, Leland, was actually the one that took the property and redeveloped it into this museum and event space. So with that, he's kind of left it to his two sons, Raymond and Bobby, to like manage the family's affairs. But it doesn't really go into detail, but it sounds like they might have some other businesses and properties and whatnot going on. But the centerpiece, or at least for the intent of their family legacy, for the sake of this book, is that the Belle Vie plantation is at the center of that. You have one of the brothers who has political ambitions. He has like some connections and whatnot. They are a pretty well-connected family, being kind of like old money at this point. And so there's history between the two families. When Karen returns to the area after having lived in New Orleans for some time, she ended up leaving New Orleans as a result of Hurricane Katrina. And by that point in time, her relationship with her daughter's father, was pretty much on the rocks. They were headed towards a breakup. And she went back home after the hurricane, reached out to this family and ended up managing the Belle Vie property. So when the story picks up, you have these various factors that have pushed her back towards Belle Vie, right? A place that she thought she'd left behind. There was some estrangement between her and her mom. So she doesn't have like a lot of social ties and connections. In the past, she was actually close to Raymond, one of the brothers. But as they got older and given their like different social standings and then her going off to New Orleans, they drifted apart. There's a little bit of discomfort with the other brother, Bobby, as he'd always been very aware of his status and position, even from a young age, and was actually quite patronizing towards her. You get the sense that he kind of looks down on her, sort of pities her. So when she reaches out, he does give her a job, but it becomes something that he kind of holds over her head, right? Given Bobby's like political power in the region, which seems like poised to expand across the state, over the years, this family, they've implemented some initiatives to help Black people in a sense, right? Leland, the father, so the previous generation, this would have been a man of the same generation as Karen's mother. He started this initiative of rehabilitating Belle Vie, right? Turning it into this museum and event space back in like the 50s and 60s, and kind of led initiatives to integrate local schools so Black children could get an education. Implemented some of these other like progressive reforms and changes and whatnot. And so when the book picks up, it's fiction, but there's a lot of commentary on the present history of the South, which is something that I've found in the years since I've moved to Atlanta and in starting Noir Histoire, traveling to other Southern cities, visiting other Southern cities, going on Black history tours, exploring various locations. There's kind of this thing of, you notice where there's a story on the surface, kind of like the cleaned up, modern, more palatable story that's told. But then quite often either slavery is glossed over or downplayed. If it's touched upon, it's in a very distant way, where a lot of effort is made to point out that this is something that happened, yes, but it was a very long time ago. It was carried out by people that lived some time ago. They were wrong, but let's just move on from this. Where there's little effort to have conversation about how the impact of slavery from both a social and economic standpoint continues to impact and affect us in the present, continues to impact and affect society in the present. And so as part of that, where you have one day while like Karen is out in the course of her duties, walking the property, inspecting the property, she goes out and checks on like the slave cabins. And she gets like an eerie feeling, which results in her not thoroughly checking the property. Later on in the day, one of the workers is out on the property doing some work, and he comes across the body of a woman. The police are called out, and it's found that this woman has been murdered, that someone slit her throat. And so with that, an investigation is launched. And because it's taken place on the Belle Vie property, the staff is questioned. Karen is amongst those who's questioned. And because she's the manager of the property, there's an expectation that she would have a good understanding of what's going on. And the investigation ends up landing on like one of the workers, because as part of the museum side of Belle Vie, there's like a little skit or a play kind of thing that supposedly tells the story of Belle Vie. But as I said, with a lot of these types of properties and attractions, they tell a sanitized version of the history where they lose the less comfortable aspects of the story. And so you have one of the young men who works on the property. He's had some trouble with the law in the past, nothing too serious. But he has had an awakening of sorts and rewrites the little skit that they typically do, right? Writing a more honest version of the history of the place. And it sounds like, at least in the first draft, it sounds absolutely terrible. This play that he's put together. But because of this and, some lies that he tells, and not really understanding the gravity of the situation, it results in the police zeroing in on him as like the number one suspect. And so over the course of the book, without giving away how the story develops, because it's one of these books where twists and turns take place and you kind of try to figure out who murdered this woman amongst the characters. So I don't really want to delve too into the specifics of what takes place in the book, but more so the broader themes. So at the same time that you're having this conversation, because given where the story takes place, this conversation about the past, the slavery, and this glossing over of things, you have this discussion about Confederate monuments, the slap in the face of, the history of enslaved people and black people. There's this conversation in the modern era of where they might not be enslaved, but this thing of migrant farm workers who are brought into the area to do farm work, and how, whether it's because they're poor or because they might be from other countries, they might be, they might not be citizens here in America, or they might be undocumented or something like that. It leaves them vulnerable to being mistreated by employers, to being exploited by employers. And unfortunately, the young woman that is murdered, turns out that she's a migrant worker. She's had some uncomfortable exchanges with her employer, with management at her company. And as a result of that, there's some, not to say that it necessarily leads to her death, but it looks like it might have played a role in her death. And so as the story unfolds through this fictional lens, you get a part of the story of the South, right? This thing about slavery, or the history of enslaved people being monetized, the application of capitalism to history, and at the same time, this whitewashing of history, glossing over the true nature of this history. And as a result of that, while it's a fictional book, it really does touch on some really interesting points. It's used as an opportunity, or I think it could be used as an opportunity for a jumping off point for having conversations about how this stuff plays out in real life. How this sanitized retelling of history, where history varies according to who's telling the story, who's sharing the story, And so I thought that was actually really interesting. I enjoyed the first book that I read by Attica Locke. That one wasn't really tied into history. It was really just more of a police procedural. But this book, I certainly enjoyed how history was tied into the social commentary, right? That at the same time that you have this sort of police procedural criminal investigation going on, rather than them finding themselves like caught up in the criminal investigation, you also had like these various interesting topics. So it's like true crime, black history, social justice issues, just tied together in a very creative way. I felt like Locke was able to take these different facets and seemingly unconnected topics and just put them together in a way that was really interesting. I found myself pulled into the story, and as the book went on, it became like an absolute page turner for me. I listened to the audiobook, but got through it like very quickly because I was like super wrapped up in the story, much as I was with her other book. And I think it's just part of her writing style, which I really like her creativity and everything. As I was reading the book, it's like I was just going on and on and on because I wanted to know what happened next. Sometimes with books like this, you can find that like the author takes like the easy way out and things happen too conveniently or in a way that just doesn't make sense. Not at all here. It's a work of fiction, but it still manages to feel realistic. Your enjoyment comes from like certainly suspending some reality, but it's like yet still the book hits on all cylinders. I was thoroughly engrossed in the story, and at no point was it like, this stuff sounds absolutely ridiculous or anything like that. As the book progresses, it felt really plausible. And that's one of the things that I like about thrillers versus like horror books or gore or whatever. I don't like true crime and books about criminal investigations that focus on just like the gore and violence. I like books within those genres that focus more on like the social commentary. Like, how do people become criminals? What did the police do to figure out the crime? How did the lawyers work to figure out the case, or to put across the case or prosecute the case or defend the case versus, the person shot them however many times and diving into the blood and guts and whatnot. So I thought it was like an incredibly creative book. It felt very fresh and new. The only thing that felt a little bit cliche was Karen kind of being presented as this single mom, like lonely black lady. I felt that bit was a bit overdone. I'm tired of those types of characters. Not the character herself, because she does have like several positive and admirable qualities, but just like this frequent thing that I'm noticing in books and movies where, and you have like the same thing or a similar thing with black male characters, the traits of black men and black women feeling as though they're like recycled, where it's like with black women, they're always like single, or, you know, if they have kids, they're single moms. They have these dreadfully boring personal lives. They don't have friends. You know, their life just feels really dry and whatnot. And I'm tired of that kind of stuff. And so that was something that I went back and forth over with the book, you know, and then it's like the situation with her and her daughter's father, like that part of the book I didn't like. I felt like it took away from the book for me. You know, because it felt like I've read this kind of stuff before. And I really don't like books, TV shows, or movies that do this romantic back and forth kind of thing. But otherwise, I felt the book was incredible, very entertaining, and I highly recommend it. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. I'd also appreciate the mention if you share it online, on social media, or with someone you think might enjoy the episode. Doing this will help other people find the show, which helps it to grow. If you aren't already subscribed to the Noir Histoire podcast, I hope you subscribe now and return to get motivated, get inspired, and get more stories of Black history made and in the making. Until next time, take care.